Hello, and thanks for joining us today with the Brainy Moms. We are Brainy Moms, and you are Brainy Moms, and so we're going to come up with some brainy ideas all together. So today we are talking about worries that many of us are having about our kids falling behind due to the COVID pandemic. So, Dr. Amy, tell us, if you would, tell the listeners about your kiddos, their ages, and how they're handling things.
Sure. Good morning, Terry.
Good morning. Hi.
Kale is 22 and he's in EMT school. He's doing it kind of a hybrid. Um, Lawson is at CU Boulder. He's 20 and he is solely online right now.
Oh, wow.
And Evan is 16. He's concurrently enrolled in high school and college as a sophomore, and he is completely online right now. How about your kids?
He's Mr. Smarty Pants.
He is Mr. Smarty Pants.
Yes,
I was going to leave that out, but you can brag on my kid all you want.
He is so Smarty Pants. He is. He's amazing. So my kiddos range from out of college all the way down to third grade. So I'll just kind of skip over the ones that aren't even in school. But my kiddos that are in school, so I've got Jadaria, who is in third grade, and then Nakota is in fifth grade. Serene is in sixth grade. Canyon is a freshman in high school, and Ian is a sophomore in high school. And we've been all over the map the past year or so, where spells of it, they've been completely online at home. Sometimes they've been face-to-face 5 days a week. Right now, my boys, my high schoolers, are kind of in a hybrid where they go some days they're online. And then my elementary school kids, let's keep our fingers crossed it stays this way. They are currently right now going 5 days a week, which is such a relief. It's so lovely. I'm so glad. Yeah. But so have your kids struggled with feeling that they're falling behind, or they're having a hard time with the COVID pandemic education model?
Yeah, so my kids don't like learning online at all, which is interesting because, I taught online for 5 years and I
Okay.
found just the relationships that I was able to build with my students being accessible to them 24/7 through an online environment was incredible. I loved it. And so I kind of made this assumption that all kids would love that access and love learning online. And I have seen the exact opposite. And so while Lawson is doing fine, Evan actually had to pivot and completely change the way he's enrolled and which classes he decided to take. So he
Okay.
decided he cannot learn STEM classes while they're learning online. So math and science completely out for him. He is only taking business classes this semester because he felt like those were the types of classes that he could handle online, whereas the more technical oriented content, he just could not engage
Right.
during online learning. Does he feel like he's falling behind? Not really. He just has shifted. Okay, I'm going to take these credits now. And then when we go back in person, he'll take the STEM credits that he needs. So he
Yeah.
doesn't really feel behind. He just feels like he had to make a compromise.
Okay.
What
Well,
about your kids?
it's so great that he was able to do that. Okay, so for example, one of my high schoolers, he's not been able to make that switch. I mean, it's like an engineering, some kind of an engineering class. And it has been a huge struggle for him. And it's so interesting that you would say that's what Evan has struggled with, because that's been the struggle as well. The basic stuff, the language arts, the history, yeah, those are so much easier to address in an online environment. But yeah, this engineering class has been awful. And then my other son he had an art class, which again, I mean, that was honestly, it was just kind of stupid. I mean, he's a good kid and he works hard and he's self-motivated. So he did the projects and did fine. It was last semester or last quarter or whatever. But to not be in person for an art class, I mean, that was, yeah, talk about falling behind. Did he do fine with his grades? Sure. Did he really learn as much art skill as he wanted to? Not remotely. Huh, that's funny, remotely. No pun intended. But he didn't. So, I mean, I guess in that sense, he did fall behind. But then I think, didn't all the kids?
Right. So let's talk about let's talk about what that means.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
we're hearing this over and over and over again, right? That our kids are all falling behind. And I think
Hmm.
all is the operative word here. I mean,
Yeah.
falling behind is relative. Arguably, all, like the majority, most of students in America and arguably across the world are in a similar boat, right? So,
Right.
in my mind, it is very doubtful to me that the achievement gap is widening because they're all
Okay.
in the same boat right now. And so, rather than saying, my child is falling behind compared to his peers,
Hmm.
the question really is, how is my child doing now compared to how my child was doing before the pandemic? That's the question that we need to be
Yeah.
asking, not my kid is falling behind. What do I do?
Right.
Because they're
Compared to
not.
peers.
They're all having to learn differently, and so to just assume that they're falling behind is a fallacy.
I think it is complicated though, because I mean, like with my different kids, with so many different kids, that I have 5 that are in school. I've got 2 others in college that are also struggling in different ways. But the 5 that are in high school, elementary school, they learn so differently. And what I'm seeing is my youngest that has some auditory processing kind of struggles. That when we were just having the online classes, she struggled so much, and it was hard to not recognize that she was falling behind compared to her peers, because the other kids were just getting it. There would be conversation going on and she couldn't participate because she was just overwhelmed. I mean, the online session would end and she would cry. But then my other kiddo, who's super verbal and social, he'd be the one, they would push some little raise their hand button. He'd be the one, like, he's on top of everything, he's raising his hand for
Right.
everything.
Right.
And he thrived. And yet I know there were kids in his class that were, falling behind, so to speak, compared to him. And so I think with some of the online stuff, there are those concerns. Are they really falling behind academically? Can they keep up with this new learning platform if they have a different kind of learning style?
Yeah, well, and also, I'm glad you said that word
Okay.
because so the idea of learning styles is also a fallacy. That's what we call a neuro myth.
Okay.
Right. So there are learning preferences,
Okay.
and some children prefer to learn with a hands on approach. Some people prefer to learn by reading. Some people prefer to learn by listening to a lecture. So yes, absolutely, children have preferences, but the way our brains work, unless we have brain injury or damage to a certain part of our brain, everyone is capable of learning from every method,
Huh.
right? It's
Okay.
just what they prefer.
Okay.
And if you want to engage kids, if you want to keep kids motivated, if you really want to reach them, then you will allow a variety of learning delivery methods so that
Okay.
you do speak to their preferences. But
Okay.
as a cognitive psychologist, it's super important for me to always set that record straight, that there's really no such thing as a learning style.
Okay. It feels like, as a mom though, it feels like those learning differences, learning preferences, whatever, it feels like they are deficits or strengths that are ingrained. I mean, my kid that can stay on top of the Zoom meeting online class, he's getting a leg up. He's doing better than the other kids. And then my little girl that struggles with it feels like a deficit for her. Like, it's such a bummer. And
Sure.
I'm,
Well,
like I said earlier, I'm so glad they're back in person. Thank goodness.
right. But you also said she's got auditory processing delays. And
I think
so
so. Yeah.
that is different than just simply not preferring to learn that way.
Ah, okay.
Right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, good. That's
Yeah,
that makes it all more clear. Okay.
absolutely.
Okay,
So,
I want to ask you a couple of other questions, but
okay.
let's take a break just real quick. And I want to talk a little bit about our sponsor. We are going to just talk about Learningrx. That's our sponsor for today. And with Learningrx, we've learned that tutoring is great for catching a child up to speed on specific subject matter in school. But is it the right option if your child is consistently struggling inside the classroom? The majority of learning struggles are caused by one or more weak cognitive skills, and Learningrx's one-on-one brain training programs are helping students learn easier, think faster, and perform better. Visit learningrx.com today to learn more. Again, that's learningrx.com. So thank you to Learningrx for sponsoring our podcast today. And incidentally, that little shout out was very timely to what we're talking about. And that's something I'm going to have to visit with my youngest daughter, I think, to get her some help that she's not getting in the classroom.
Yeah.
Okay, so learning loss.
Yeah.
You have told me that is a slippery statistic. What is learning loss?
So learning loss is this idea that because of missed time in the classroom, because of the COVID pandemic, students have lost learning.
Okay.
Right? Learning. And the reason that I call that a slippery statistic is because it's super difficult to quantify something that seems completely universal, right? Like we talked about before, all students are experiencing changes in the way that they're being schooled because of the pandemic. So how do you quantify something that seems really universal, but it's not universal at all? And I say that because we can't generalize learning loss across students or across schools or across the country because it is deeply individualized based on so many different factors, right? So the idea of how much learning loss has occurred is dependent upon multiple variables within each student. And so you want me to talk about some of those?
Yeah, I'm thinking about some articles I had pulled up as well, where, I mean, if you just do a quick Google search kind of thing, which I did, it's so interesting that almost everything you're going to come up with when you look at like the effect, like learning and COVID, the effect of learning, education effects with COVID, whatever search words you use. Over and over again, the things I kept seeing and reading as I'm looking here at my computer were about problems with depression, with feelings of isolation, anxiety, loss of social connection. And I really had a hard time coming up with much that talked about actual measurable, like you said, statistical evidence of drops in grades, except for I came across a couple of studies that talked about the impact of COVID on college students, college grades. And that was interesting that, there was a study here. Can I find it? Where was it? I had it pulled up.
Well, while you're looking for that, let me speak to why I think that it's easier to quantify the impact at the college level than it is. One reason is because most of the courses that you take in college are self-contained, right? So you take a history course, you take a engineering course. Those aren't courses that are building on each other. They're individual courses that only last one semester. So from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, how much learning has occurred. It's a quick, rapid 10 to 16 week measurement process. Whereas at the elementary school level, curriculum is spiral, which means it continues to build on itself day after day, month after month, year after year. And it's not self-contained into 10 or 16 weeks, right? So that learning is measured how? Teachers give grades, but then what we do as a country, unfortunately, is measure learning based on standardized test scores that are given in the spring and the fall. Right. So there's a delay in being able to see how much loss has actually occurred because we have to look at those long-term trends based on these generalized global testing techniques right, that absolutely critically ignore the individual differences among students, that we have to look at to actually be able to know what learning loss is happening.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, I mean, I think teachers also can't help but in elementary school, they're grading comparatively. I mean, like every elementary school is so different. Some of them, you get an E for an excellent, S for satisfactory. Some you get, a 1 to 4 score. Some of them still grade, A, B, C, D, that kind of thing. I mean, there's a huge variety of ways that teachers and school districts are grading kids and scoring kids, and obviously, it's comparatively with the other kids in their classroom. And so that, like you're saying, I mean, that changes the perspective of what is really falling behind anyway.
Right.
Because if the whole class can't get to a point where they really grasp whatever little chemistry project they're doing, well, the kids aren't going to be, judged. They get a D or an F because the project didn't come across as well online.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Then you have to step back and go, okay, they're okay. They're okay. My kids are okay. None of the kids got that chemistry assignment. But then you're like, darn, 2 years down the road, are my kids going to be further behind than I wish they would have been? Well, maybe so, but the whole world is.
Right. Right. Well, but then you ask, what do you do about it? Right. Do you
Yeah.
just repeat the entire year for these kids,
Ugh.
making this sweeping assumption that they're all behind, that
Yeah.
they learned nothing, so we just have to repeat it, right?
Mm.
Is that the answer? Oh my gosh, absolutely not. So the best way to find out where each student is to assess them on the current year's curriculum, kind of like giving a pretest at the beginning of the year to find
Yeah.
out what is your level of prior knowledge. Well, you may be surprised to find out they're not as behind as you think they are,
Yeah.
right? So there's no reason to repeat something, right? If they've kept up or if they are where they're supposed to be. But by doing a sort of pretest, a prior knowledge evaluation,
Mm-hmm.
you get a more accurate picture of what you need to reteach or where you need to start in the curriculum,
Yeah.
than you would if you wait around, for your springtime standardized test results that don't come out until the fall, by the way.
Okay.
And the fall don't come out until the spring, right? So there's this huge delay if you're
Oh
waiting
gosh.
around. And again, and we talked about this in another episode, that when you start averaging scores, you miss the
Mm-hmm.
nuances.
Right.
And so each teacher should evaluate their curriculum in the here and now to find out where each student is landing.
Yeah.
But let me go back to talking about what can influence where those kids are landing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
things like the level of proficiency that those kids had before the pandemic started.
Okay.
What type of access they had to technology and internet connection
Mm-hmm.
during remote learning, the quality of the remote instruction they actually got. I saw some huge variations last spring when we first went into lockdowns
Uh-huh.
that school districts who already had an infrastructure in place, who already had hybrid options and online learning options, they could seamlessly pivot
Right.
to 100% online learning. Whereas other school districts, like a rural district that my sister teaches high school math in, they had
Mm-hmm.
nothing in place, like
Yeah.
absolutely nothing in place. So she's hanging a whiteboard, on her dining room wall trying to teach advanced calculus,
Oh,
because she didn't have any of the online technologies. There no learning management system, that a lot of districts had in place. So that's going to make a huge difference.
mhm.
You mentioned one of your kids who's self-motivated. Well, what is your child's capacity for independence and independent learning
Right.
on the off days from remote instruction, right? That makes
Mhm.
a huge difference. How much supplemental instruction is the parent capable of providing, able to, or interested in providing, right?
Yeah.
Or what about personal trauma that a
Mm.
child experienced? Did they lose a family member to COVID? Did they get sick themselves? Were they exposed to increased domestic violence because of the lockdown, right? That's
Right.
going to impact how much progress they were able to make while they were learning. So we see huge differences in these variables, particularly related to socioeconomic status, right? So we
Right.
know that the poorer school districts, or the children within those school districts that are in lower socioeconomic um, categories were the hardest hit,
Right.
right?
For so many different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that kids in a lower socioeconomic level may not have had the resources to begin with, the
Right.
technological resources. The school may not have been able to provide them. I mean, we did a choice school. We choiced our elementary school kids into a different school district this past year. And the school district they're in, it's a small school, it's well funded. They were all given iPads. And so they do their work on iPads. That's fantastic. But there are tons of schools, elementary schools especially, my goodness, that don't have that kind of funding, that don't have that kind of privilege. And so it makes it so much harder. And then I know that there's kids, even at the school my kids are at, they don't have the internet access or availability at their homes because they can't afford it, or for example, or where we live up in the mountains. It's our county is a really, really rural county, Teller County,
Mm-hmm.
Colorado, and lots of rural areas and up in the mountains. And so where we are, we get very, very spotty cell service and internet service, and that makes it hard.
Sure. And when you have multiple children trying to share the same
Yes.
bandwidth on an
Uh-huh.
already weak internet connection because you live in the mountains.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so many things that factor into it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so
and
we
then
have
loss
to
of,
just stop making generalizations. We have
yeah.
to stop just making assumptions that everyone has had this huge amount of learning loss,
Mm-hmm.
or swinging the pendulum in the opposite direction and, you know, underestimating the learning loss. Because what happens if
Yeah.
we underestimate? Then we miss an opportunity to provide remediation to students who actually need remediation.
Right.
And so we have to look at this at the individual level. We just have to. Is it going to be costly? Yes. Is it going to be time consuming? Yes. Is it going to be labor intensive? Yes. But if we want an accurate quantification of what that learning loss looks like, it's the only way that we can do it. It's the only way.
Yeah. And the only way that we're going to be able to make a difference eventually, that it's going to have to be up to parents, teachers, schools, and district leaders, I think, next year and the following year, to not just all of a sudden let kids fall behind, but like you said, do the things, remediation for those individual kids who maybe did not have the technological opportunities to be able to keep up,
Yeah.
or who had the personality styles, or even the learning struggles that my littlest has. I mean, there's so many different factors. And yeah, you're right. I mean, remediation, that's going to have to happen down the road.
Sure.
I
Well, not
found
just
that.
down the road, but here's the key, right? So our our, our listeners are tuning in because they want tips, right?
Yeah.
So we're asking a question, is my kid falling behind during COVID? Well, let's ask, what do we do?
Yeah.
Right. And so focus on the now. How is your child doing
Nice.
right now?
Right.
And that determines what your next step is.
Yeah.
Is your child managing, keeping up, moving forward? Then you have the ability to wait this out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But is your child really struggling? Then you need to know, what is your child struggling in?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Communicate with your child's teacher, which subjects is my child struggling in right now? And your children, right? Your children compared to how they were before the pandemic. And so how they're doing now dictates what you need to do for them now. So whether they need some online tutoring, right, just to help keep them caught up on the content or catch up on a little bit of content,
Mm-hmm.
or are they struggling across the board because they've got some cognitive deficits that need to be
Right.
remediated differently, right? Something that tutoring isn't going to actually help.
Well, and I think you also mentioned earlier, you mentioned something that I think should be really encouraging to all of us that have elementary school kids. I think even all the way up into high school, maybe junior and senior year, this isn't true, but you talked about the education is like a spiral. And I think that's something that, yeah, we can all be comforted by that. Okay, in kindergarten, they start hearing about different cloud formations. And then they hear about it again in first grade. And then they get a little more in depth in second grade and a little more in depth in third grade. But so if they're getting, I talk a lot in homeschooling and child development research about exposure, that we don't always have to just drive it home. You've got to learn this, memorize it. If we can offer kids exposure to subject material, then the next year, as they spiral around, they're going to go, oh, wait, I remember that. Cumulonimbus, was that it? They have familiarity. And so even if they've just been getting it enough to get that exposure this year, they're going to spiral back around.
Yes.
They're going to get that information again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's true even as at the early childhood level. I have moms who worry, hey, my child won't let me read to him. You know what? You read anyway while your child does what he's doing.
Nice.
He will hear you.
Exposure.
Right? Yes. So your child can be playing with his Legos at the table. You can still read a story. That child does not have to be sitting on your lap looking at the pictures.
That's good.
Right? They are still going to hear you read to them, and absolutely exposure.
So good.
Yeah.
Okay, just because I wanted to cycle back to this college grades, because I thought it was so interesting. So it's a website called Inside Higher Education, insidehighered.com. And they have some cool statistics from a big survey of over 14,000 freshmen, sophomore, and junior students in 2020. And so from 232 different colleges, public and private. But anyway, the thing they came up with from this survey is that 85% of those surveyed said that the COVID pandemic has had a negative effect on their performance. But it's like you said, that's one little class, one semester. And so that may be that those grades were lower than they would have wanted because it was difficult for them to learn in that online environment or whatever. They weren't able to take the engineering class they wanted to. But this is interesting. 5% said the pandemic had a positive influence on their grades. So that's just interesting thinking about, all my kids and their different learning styles, because I definitely have one out of the 9 that I see thrives in the solitude of the online learning. And I would venture to say it's been a positive experience. He's doing better. His grades are better. His learning is better. His focus, his motivation. So, there's going to be some kids. Let's be encouraged by that too. You
Absolutely.
might have one of those kiddos that thrives. So
I don't, but yes, many of our listeners might for sure. So, and I have to tell you that I have thrived in a remote environment. As well. As an introvert, it has been energizing for me to not have water cooler chit chat, right? To be able to solely focus on these intentional interactions only, right?
Whereas I, on the other hand, have struggled in and out of deep, dark, lonely depression.
Talk to me.
I'm like, oh my goodness, if I don't get out of the house and have adult conversation, I'm going to cry.
Right.
And I know a lot of moms, we have felt that way. We're going to talk about that in other episodes. We're not going to talk about that right now.
Right. But actually, that's in an upcoming episode.
Oh my goodness. So, yes. How to cope. Okay.
Right. In fact, let's just share with our listeners that our next episode is going to be on how the language of talking to stay-at-home moms and working moms is very different, and what not to say to each group.
Yeah, especially during this pandemic, these weird changes.
Absolutely.
So talking about tutoring, talking about what to do. So if I do worry that my little one, my youngest, I've really worried now that they're back face to face, it's better, but worried that she was really falling behind. So talk to me about tutoring, talk to me about intervention if you do feel like your kid is struggling.
Yeah. So luckily there are some great options. First, I would encourage moms to leverage the resources available through the school system because those are free. And so if the schools are providing additional study sessions, group tutoring sessions, after school. Take advantage of those, right? Because we just talked about there are going to be groups of children who are in the same boat, just needing to revisit content that they struggled to pick up on remotely, perhaps. So take advantage of the resources that your school system is offering for sure. And then there are always tutors available, whether they're in person or online. There are always tutoring programs and tutoring businesses, that exist where your child can get some small group instruction on content that they missed or that they need extra practice on. And so the nice thing about online tutoring is that you can have access from anywhere, and almost every subject is available that way. And typically the online tutoring sessions are one-on-one. So for students who thrive in that type of interaction. But again, if you're tired of the online, and if online was what the problem was in the first place for your child, then try to leverage some tutoring that's available in person. For sure.
There's a great article about this subject that just came out in February on moms.com website, MOMS.com. And if you just go to moms.com and you can just search online tutoring, it's a great article, how to know if online tutoring is right for your tween. And they direct it towards that age group, but it's information that's just super helpful for your kids, honestly, from, kindergarten through high school. And there's great links in the article. It talks about the benefits of online tutoring and, the downsides, like what kiddos, the times that it's not going to be helpful. If your child has a learning disability, autism, other learning struggles, even like ADHD or dyslexia, that may be a little bit harder. That online tutoring that's looking at a specific course or a specific subject, that may not get to the root of what your child needs. So it's a great article, check it out. And what if your kid is in that position where, again, I would say this for my youngest, I cannot fathom that online tutoring would help her, because that's what was so challenging for her. So what other options, Dr. Amy, would you suggest?
Yeah. So, we've talked about Jay Daria's issues with auditory processing. And so we know that learning struggles are typically caused, by some sort of cognitive deficit. Either they didn't learn the material the first time because it wasn't taught properly, or because they weren't able to process the information because they have a cognitive deficit of some sort.
Right.
And so tutoring will help with information that they didn't pick up because it just wasn't either taught efficiently, or they missed school, or it was an online learning issue. But if they have a cognitive deficit, and what I mean by a cognitive deficit is a weakness in an underlying learning skill, like working memory or attention, or the efficiency of how fast they process information, or how well they reason. Those are cognitive skills. And so if there's a deficit or a weakness in a cognitive skill, that weakness needs to be remediated. Otherwise, you're just trying to reteach content when the child can't grasp it.
Right.
And so that needs brain training.
Right.
And of course, we advocate for brain training because we're brain trainers, right?
Yes.
We're brain training researchers. And so that's where our sponsor can actually come in and help then. And then what happens is you remediate those cognitive deficits. They still might need a little bit of tutoring to catch up on the content that they missed, right? But then it'll be smoother sailing.
Right. Okay, so we talked about this in an earlier podcast, but just again, I'm going to say Mr. Smarty Pants, you're Mr. Smarty Pants, Evan. You have that personal experience with Evan. I can't remember what you said. It was 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th, something in there where you noticed that he had really fallen behind, and you were worried he was falling behind, and he was. It wasn't due to the COVID pandemic, but he was falling behind. and he needed more help. And so Learningrx was amazing for Evan, right? Tell us
Right,
a little
because
bit about
he had severe auditory processing deficits, and so his struggle was with spelling. He wasn't even able to
Mhm.
spell his own name in fourth grade,
Yeah.
and so by remediating those cognitive deficits, then he was able to go back into the classroom and learn across subjects. Right, so reading
Right.
and spelling, your reading and spelling ability impacts all of the subjects,
Mhm.
right? Because we read and write throughout
Yeah.
and across all the subjects.
And how different it would have been. I mean, it was by the grace of God, so to speak, that you knew of Learningrx, that you were involved with Learningrx, and so you knew that's what he needed.
Mhm.
Because I think so many parents would be like, "Oh man, he's having trouble in spelling. We just gotta beat him harder over the head with these spelling words. We're gonna study for 2 hours every day."
Right.
Or they would, maybe get him a tutor for spelling, but that wasn't the underlying problem. And I think that's so valuable. Even as we're looking at this specific current topic, is my kid falling behind? And for me specifically, for my little one, why was she falling behind? I couldn't have hired a tutor that would have helped her. She's got an underlying cognitive something, auditory processing going on. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to figure that out. We're
Yeah.
going to have to step into this. Or you know what? We have the privilege to step into this. And by the grace of God, I know about Learningrx as well. And there are other programs out there that are very valuable that can help treat those underlying cognitive issues. But I think for parents, it's great to recognize that tutoring and cognitive training are different,
Yeah.
and that cognitive training can be a huge help when you're not talking about my kid is falling behind subject material, because all the kids are falling behind subject material.
Right.
And so then they're not really falling behind. That's just the state of the world we're in.
Yeah.
But if your kid has some underlying cognitive issues, so they are at a deficit compared to their peers in this current learning environment, there is something to do. There is something we can step into.
There is.
Yep.
All right. Well, this has
I
been
hope-
fun.
Yeah, I hope that offers some hope and encouragement. I know it does to me. And I've said this before in an earlier podcast. Yep, I'll be stepping into the Learningrx cognitive training for my youngest, hopefully this summer or in the fall. And yeah, just keep that in mind. Moms out there, if you're listening, you can check it out. Learningrx.com is a great resource. And I think be encouraged as well, what Dr. Amy said, that your kid may not really be falling behind like you think at all. So be encouraged.
All right. So look, we're busy moms and you're busy moms. We appreciate you joining us today, but we're out.
We're out.